Hello, hello. I am Sinner, and I am back. New year, new me. We are back in the big 2026. And I thought I would do something which I've seen some people do, and I thought might be fun, which is to start 2026 off with a recap of 2025 and certain things that stood out to me, sort of just interesting things that have happened in the political world. And not so much that they've happened, but how people have reacted to them. So the first thing I want to talk about is tariffs. Tariffs happened at the start of this year. It was the big deal. Trump coming in with all these new kind of ridiculous tariffs for protectionism and industrialization, which is kind of interesting because the tariff fiasco became a good example of, in my opinion, democracy. Hobbes talks about this in democracies. Sometimes people will just disagree with a position or an idea, not because they necessarily, you know, agree with the idea in question, but because the wrong person says it. And what we saw with tariffs at the start of this year was this really interesting thing where all of a sudden left wingers who, generally speaking, are pro industrialization and pro protectionism, that's like a new thing. Both the right and the left are pro those things now. Um, all of a sudden became free market capitalists when um, when Trump was proposing all these tariffs. Oh wow, this is all of a sudden a horrible thing because it's going to drive up costs. Blah 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 blah. It doesn't matter if it's going to bring more jobs to the U.S. in the long term. In the short term, it's horrible. We shouldn't do it. And all of a sudden, a lot of right wingers became, protectionists and like had socialist leanings where they're like, oh wow, actually, tariffs are actually a great idea. I wouldn't have agreed with it if if Kamala had done it. I would have definitely called Kamala a commie for doing it. But because Trump's doing it, now all of a sudden it's a great idea. And you really only saw, in my opinion, the only principled people who seemed to actually have a consistent take on it were the libertarians. They were always against tariffs, and they're, still against tariffs. It wasn't the fact that Trump was saying it, they weren't in the miasma of politics. I think libertarians, because they're so small, such a small group of people, they sort of avoid the the right left like swinging, but they were the only ones who seemed to actually stick to their principles and go like, okay, well, we're against tariffs, but we've always been against them. It wasn't a case of the right being suddenly for them and the left being suddenly against them. I thought that was interesting. Another interesting thing that's happened is the topic of immigration has continued to be a big deal in Australia and in America. Um, Mainly, uh, in Australia, it is directly related to the fact that we're dealing with a cost of living crisis. It's very expensive to live in Australia. And um, the there were many protests this year in Australia, big anti-immigration protests. And it was quite interesting because it was a very good job of the Australian press doing this tactic called poisoning the well. Basically, uh, it's a tactic where if something seems appealing or nice, what you do is you throw in something horrible to, um, you know, make people not go near it. So an example might be like, let's say there's a website, hypothetically, that is great for downloading movies. And then the movie company, the licensing company might find out about it and start putting viruses on that website. This is hypothetically. And then people will go, oh, nah, I'm not going to download from there because I might get a virus. Well, in the immigration protests, you had like 10, 20, like a tiny number of uh, neo Nazis show up, and in the media, everything, the whole protest, everyone there was a neo Nazi because there was like 5 of them or 10 of them. And I think that was a pretty good example because it was very successful. A lot of people came away with the attitude that it's, you're a neo-Nazi or you're a racist if you have anything negative to say about immigration. And they tried it with the um, this year with also the welcome to country at Anzac Day. There was a couple. There was like one neo-Nazi at one event, and you know the ABC and the media labeled everyone there who's against it neo-Nazi. It didn't. I don't think it really worked as well as it did with the immigration protests, but it is what it is. Next, we saw ICE, which was a big thing in America, all the deportations of illegal immigrants, and the thing I want to focus on with that is the fact that the people who, how do I put this? It's this interesting thing where anti-immigration as a policy was traditionally a left-wing policy. It was traditionally a position that was a socialist position because people historically saw immigrants and immigration as a tool of capitalists to basically devalue labor and make the working class poorer and the bourgeoisie richer, you know, directly at the expense of the working class. But I think generally speaking, what we've seen in 2025 is like pro-immigration is like completely ossified as a left-wing dogma. You cannot be left-wing and be anti-immigration. It's just off the table. You have to be pro-immigration. I think before, some people might have had that old, you know, well, I'm a socialist, but I'm anti-immigration. But now you're just a red fascist if you're an anti-immigration socialist. So, and you've seen that with I think ICE and as well, like how everyone was talking about ICE as like this Nazi fascist thing, and the fact that we've also seen, which was interesting, a lot of the states disobey the federal government, which was kind of interesting. And all the time, you have like Antifa protecting basically the material interests of the capitalist class. They'll literally like fight ICE um, at some factory, or some workshop because the owner obviously has like underpaid laborers in there. So it's quite interesting to see. Like, I thought it was really absurd seeing communists literally fighting the government to protect the material interests of the capitalist class. But what do I know? Yeah, but that was something. Um, and also with the UK now, reform is, thanks to this immigration issue, basically solidified itself as the new right. The Conservatives are kind of cooked. It's the equivalent of like um, the only people who are really voting Tory now are just boomers who like don't know what they don't really engage in politics. They're just like are loyal and they're just going voting the same every time. You know. Um, Another thing I want to talk about is the changing attitudes towards Gaza. I think and Israel. I think this year, especially with the rise of Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes, we've seen the the right basically um, not eat itself, but the right has split on the issue of Israel, um, where the right is now taking a more, you have the newer right, the America First right, I guess you could say, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, the Gen Z right, which is anti-Israel, very much anti-Israel, and then you have the boomer right, which is ardently pro-Israel. And this has been a new development. I think most it's a generational thing, I think, but um, that's I think a new thing. I don't think that was during October 7th or even earlier. It was seen as mainly only a left-wing thing to be like a left-wing thing and a neo-Nazi thing to be pro-Palestine. And this gets into something which I'll talk about later. But one other thing I'll talk about is free speech. Free speech has become a left-wing issue as well now. Free speech and sort of being able to have like a controversial political opinion as a left-winger is now a trouble. It's hard for them. It's harder for them now because historically the left has sort of had a bit of a capital on policing speech. And this will tie in with Israel, but the left has constantly, for as long as I can remember, as long as I've really known anything about politics, one of the things that's been a big issue for right wingers is if you say the wrong thing in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could lose your job, you could lose your degree, you could, as a professor, lose your tenureship. Tenured professors losing their job was like a big deal. Um, and obviously, you could get silenced on every social media platform, lose your ability to buy and sell things because like PayPal or Visa would block you, or the banks won't work with you, this sort of stuff. So free speech was always a right wing issue because they were the only ones being attacked. But I think since like 2016 and now, what's happened is the right has sort of like been black pilled on free speech, where they're sort of going like, well, you can't, if you're playing by these rules, where the moment you get into power, you abuse the institutions to gain more political power, we're just going to start doing the same thing. And Trump's been doing a lot of that, and it's now like if you're a pro-Palestine left winger, there's now threats of losing your job, losing your degree, all sorts of stuff. So it's a big deal now. It's now, and obviously with Charlie Kirk, there was a bit of cancel culture kicking up, right-wing cancel culture, not to the same extent as left-wing cancel culture was back in its heyday, but there was a little bit of that kicking around. Um, so we're starting to see the right adopt left-wing tactics around speech, and that's sort of an interesting thing because now we're in this weird position where, with the exception of libertarians, um, both sides are like, I'm pro free speech, except it's just for me. you know, I'm not actually principally. I think there's still a good few right wingers who are the principled pro free speech types, but I think it's going away. I think you're seeing more people on the right. They're kind of black pilled. They're like, yeah, screw it. I'm glad this person lost their job. I'm glad this person, you know, got arrested or whatever. So that's something new, and it's mainly left wingers who are pro-Palestine. And I thought that was uh, personally, I thought it was really annoying that left wingers were complaining about it because they were the ones who came up with the laws in the first place and all the rules, with all the hate speech stuff. And what else is there to talk about? Old Epstein was a big issue this year. Um, Epstein and Trump's, what would you say, dancing around. I'm going to release them. They're not real. They are real, but I'm not going to release them. It's a left wing thing. His whole, you know, not committing to one story stuff was another splitting point for the right, where you had like the new right be like, okay, well, he's clearly compromised by Israel, and the old right being like, trust the plan, like he's actually not a nonce, trust me. And he's definitely a nonce. Let's just keep it real. He's definitely a nonce. Um, but yeah, that was another interesting thing, and it was the first time like the whole Epstein didn't kill himself thing when Epstein died was like a right wing conspiracy theory, and all the Mossad stuff, and was a right wing conspiracy theory. And now the left is on board with it. Now, this is the thing. I'm sort of skeptical to what extent they're actually believing in it, or if it's just another thing where it's like, well, this looks bad for Trump, so we're gonna push this, because my question is, if this is the case, would the left turn around on Pizzagate? I've actually, I don't actually really know the whole Pizzagate story, but I know back then that was another of the right-wing conspiracy theories, along with Epstein was Pizzagate. Um, but maybe the left will flirt with Pizzagate again. Who knows? Maybe that'll be the test. If they're big on Epstein, but they like don't care or still think that Pizzagate's like a ridiculous conspiracy theory that I can just ignore, then yeah, that's the that's the test. If they ignore Pizzagate and think it's just if they just wave it off as nonsense, then the whole Epstein stuff wasn't genuine. It was just a political bit, I guess you could say. And I think the last thing I want to talk about is the recent terror attacks. There was a stabbing of a synagogue in the UK, and there was obviously the shooting in Australia. Both of those were very big deals, um, and I think it's going to do nothing for the political, uh, how do I put it, the political shape of the countries of the UK and Australia, because there was around 2016 there was a lot of terrorist attacks both in the UK and in Australia, Islamic terrorist attacks, and really it was quite interesting. At first there was like this scare narrative in Australia, and then it became this thing where like it was it was racist to put people on terrorist watch lists, and then like it sort of fizzled out and there weren't any terrorist attacks, so nobody talked about it. But after a while, it became like this position where like, well, to blame Islam for Islamic terrorism is sort of racist. You can't really do it. It's not all of us. It's just some of us. This whole thing. Um, and I think some of that old talk is kicked back up. But because we've all had that, Australia's had that conversation 10 years ago and it went nowhere. It's going to go nowhere again. And I think it's probably the same for um, the UK. Maybe it'll push the anti-immigration thing more. And one other thing I want to talk about, which is that um, the Jewish communities have seemingly become mostly conservative now. Uh, and there's like this Jewish conservative anti-Islamic alliance that's sort of building up, where I think the Jewish communities in Australia and in America and in Britain can sort of play on the fact that there's a lot of anti-Islamic sentiment in Anglo countries and use that. I think less so in the US. They're just not. It's not really as big of a deal in the US. It's the biggest deal is in the UK because they have the grooming gangs, which have been a big thing. Um, and yeah, I think that's an interesting development as well. The fact that it's now like a Jewish conservative alliance against the Muslims, basically, for the most part. Um, and actually, on the grooming gangs and on Minnesota, which was so these are sort of more recent. Minnesota's very recent. I will say one interesting thing is the left kind of just defending institutional corruption, which is kind of funny because, you know, I think part of it is the fact that it really doesn't look like institutional white supremacy if you have Somalis or Pakistanis getting away with crime and it just going unnoticed by the government. It doesn't play into the narrative of institutional racism and all that sort of stuff. But it's been very strange to see like this this new pattern of left wingers basically defending corruption or people getting away with crimes so long as the people who are the criminals aren't white. It's very strange. Um, very strange. And I don't really know why it's so left wing. I think the thing is they see that like if you accuse a brown person of corruption or a crime, it's magically instantly racist. So you're not allowed to do that. You can't accuse them of crimes. It's racist, guys. It's racist. So I think that's probably why, but I thought it was interesting. You um, yeah, but I think that's it. That's the whole my recap. I think you're seeing a lot of shifting of opinions and stuff, mainly based around not because of principles, but news cycles and narrative games and so on, which is interesting but sad. Um, but yeah, I think that's all. Happy New Year, and let's look forward to 2026, see what happens. Who knows what will happen? I think it'll be an interesting year. Anyway, that's all. I am Sinner. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.